Now, the question at the front of every innovator's mind at this stage should be this: what is the smallest possible experiment I can run to test my biggest assumption? And that's the one that's going to have the most impact with least certainty. But I'm going to run an experiment which lowers the stakes tremendously. And one of the things that you'll hear said often around this idea is dream big, start small, move fast. So you're looking for a tiny experiment that will test your biggest assumption. It's massively lowering the stakes, it's massively lowering the risk. We're working with a very small unit, a very low cost unit, to generate some very rich data that will help us understand whether we should even move ahead with this idea. Now, this whole philosophy, I guess, and language came about from a guy called Eric Ries. Here he is, and his book that came out in 2011 called The Lean Startup. If you haven't read this book, you must read this book. If you're interested in this space, or at least go onto YouTube and find a talk from Eric covering the Lean Startup. As an aside, I've deliberately included this in this part of the course. If you Google the Lean Startup, if you Google what we're going to talk about in a moment, minimum viable product, you will find so much free help, resources, examples, templates, frameworks to help you. I'm just giving you a starting point with this course, but the web is rich with help in this area. So I'm just putting that out there. Go and after this, get online and Google this stuff. But Eric Ries introduced the idea of the minimum viable product in his book, which is the smallest possible test that you can run to test your biggest, most risky assumption. So this mindset automatically lowers the stakes of exploring an idea. And I was in a workshop once and someone paraphrased it back to me really well. He said, "So Elvin, what you're really saying is, instead of asking when we have an idea, what can we build for 50k? We should be asking, what can we learn for 50 quid or 50 pounds or 50 bucks, 50 whatever." It's tiny amount of money that we invest in understanding the answer to a question about a big assumption that we have. And our instinct usually, at least in corporate life, is to throw a ton of money at something just to get to first base. Often it's so wasteful, and often what happens is as soon as money appears and resource appears, it attracts a ton of politics and reporting, and it drains the energy from the project and the ambition is lowered. This helps overcome all of those problems by starting small. Now, one of my favorite examples of an MVP, or a minimum viable product, actually predates the book by almost 40 years, and it's from IBM. So back in the late 70s, they were thinking about speech recognition as a potential business in the future. And they were curious about how much money could be made from it. But really, what do they not yet understand? So they came up with this idea that they would put someone in a room with a screen, and they would talk to the screen, and the screen would magically have the words appear on the screen. So they brought some people in and said, just talk to the screen and then you'll see what happens. And sure enough, the words magically appeared on the screen. And they loved it. And so far, so good. The desirability, big tick, this is something that they like. What they didn't know was that in another room, there was somebody with a headset on who was typing everything that was being said via a hidden microphone. So from the user's perspective, they were having this really authentic experience of what voice recognition software could do. But actually, IBM had spent next to nothing just seeing whether it was something that a user would get, would understand, how they would respond, without having to write a line of code. What was really interesting is they decided not to go ahead with investing in this, because when they started to play around with the experiment, they learned that actually talking for several hours can start to give you a sore throat, and people were struggling to do it for very long. The second thing was, put a few of these in a room, suddenly the noise gets quite substantial. And the third thing is confidentiality issues. You can't talk about everything out loud. So their idea was maybe we could completely disrupt desktop computing, but they realized that probably it's not time yet to do this. We do still need offices. People can't talk all of the time. So for me, this is a great example of an organization that's dreaming big and then starting small. And typically the process that you're going to go through, I'm going to show you some more examples in a moment, is this 5-stage process. So first of all, you come up with an idea. Then you list those assumptions in the way that we did just now, and you're looking for your leap of faith assumptions. The next step is you create a tiny experiment, a minimum viable product, small, cheap, fast. And your aim is to not prove that the thing works. You're looking for learning. You're looking to understand, when I put this in front of someone, do the things that we think will happen, will they happen? Or will they happen in some way? And based on that data, you can make some decisions. What happened? What should we do? So should we continue? Because actually the thing that we thought would happen did turn out to happen, and we were right. Somewhat. This happened, but that didn't happen. But what we did learn in the process was this brand new thing that customers want. So let's pivot our direction. Or actually, should we just cut our losses now? We can see very quickly that this is not something that is going to scale or turn into a business for whatever reason. And you're trying to get around that loop as quickly as possible. This is what Google does. Maximizing the speed of idea to decision as quickly, as efficiently as possible. And you hear about organizations all around the world now, software-driven organizations that are publishing, hundreds, thousands of experiments on their websites every day. Amazon is famous for doing this, and they are getting instant feedback loops on whether something works or not. This is what we're doing here. We're trying to create really efficient learning feedback loops, testing assumptions, understanding whether we should work on them or not, pivot maybe in one direction or drop the idea straight away and move on to the next one. It's about creating huge efficiencies in the innovation process and creating more of a desire to step into more disruptive ideas because the stakes are so much lower. So let's look at an example of an organization that put this into practice right from the start. So Uber, when they first started out, legend has it, it was the CEO founder standing in a taxi line, waiting for a cab and turning to a colleague and saying, "Oh, wouldn't it be great if you could just pull out your phone, push a button and a taxi arrived?" And from that statement, apparently Uber was born. But when they started out, they were really clunky. They had a very basic web application that actually, when you wanted to use it, you still had to send a text to someone to say that you wanted a taxi. And then behind the scenes, people are scurrying around trying to call taxis to come and pick you up. They were just testing the idea to see whether people would go for the idea of pushing a button and watching an icon move on a screen. And this is called a Wizard of Oz MVP. It looks as if it's all working seamlessly, but behind the scenes there's pedals and there's sticky tape and there's all sorts of stuff going on to trying to make it work. And that's how they started. It's how many startups these days begin. And then we have this journey of them discovering that, yeah, this is worth doing. They become, they register as an app developer on Apple. They develop their first app, starting to make some money, going on to new platforms. And they're not then just scaling the product, they're scaling the geography and all the other dimensions of the business. But all the way through, they're using this test and learn journey. They're not making any assumptions about what is the right way to serve. Well, first of all, is there a problem to solve? And then how do we solve the problem? They're learning all the way through on that journey. So that's, very rough and ready look at Uber. You can look that up yourself. There's lots of stories out there around it. Equally, here are some other examples that you might want to look at online in your own time. Different examples of different kinds of MVP, where people have spent mostly, apart from probably Virgin Atlantic, you've got to start somewhere with some things, but mostly, how can we create an authentic experience for the customer where they will give us reliable feedback on whether this is something that they're going to buy, and then as we go through the process, how they want the solution to show up in their lives. We're testing and learning all the way through, but we're starting from a very, very modest base. So one final example, just for a bit of fun, but actually there's some really interesting learning that you can take from it. How about coming up with an idea for an MVP for an ATM cash machine? Have a look at this.
Till train start, check out please.
Okay, we've got 4659.
I love that. It's silly, but you look at what they've done there. They've created a really authentic customer experience, but they've spent next to nothing on it. Anyway, just a bit of fun. So let's finish up now with a couple of final ideas. So one of the things that I find when I'm working with organizations is that when you introduce culture of experimentation, or even just some tools to start playing with, some quite profound things start to happen. Here's Dennis O'Flynn, who features in the book Be Less Zombie. There's a case study in there for Pernod Ricard UK. So Pernod Ricard, if you don't know, is a large global drinks company. And they introduced experimentation right across the organisation, and they experienced some really profound changes, I would say, in almost every part of their business as a result of the experiments that they started to run. I've quoted him there as saying, experiments changed everything. They really did. I was there to see it. But something else that he also used to say, and we picked this up in the book, was he'd say to people, don't bring me an idea, bring me an experiment. Meaning, I need the data. If you want me to make a decision on something, go away, you have permission, run the experiment, low risk, low cost, high speed, high learning, and come back to me and tell me what you've learned. That's something that's a good use of my time, not listening to ideas that, in some respects, what value do they have until we've gone and tested them? So some of the things that Pernod Ricard and many other organizations find when they start running experiments are, well, as we said before, minimum viable products, experiments, they lower the stakes for pursuing bold ideas, which means people are going to have more of an appetite to pursue them. It reduces the fear and risk of innovation all round. It means that bolder ideas start to show up in greater numbers. The cupboard is no longer bare, and you can actually get started more meaningfully with them rather than debating them for several weeks, months before you feel like you've got a starting point. I like to frame this as pay-as-you-go innovation rather than having to pay for a lot of money up front just to invest to get something moving. You're only paying when the data of an experiment suggests that that's a good choice. So you start very small, and as you build a case through data, through larger and larger experiments, you unlock larger amounts of money. So it's a very smart way to invest in innovation. It also gives you data. Every experiment that you run teaches you something that probably nobody else knows. You will have run an experiment in a certain way. You will have learnt particular data because of the way that you ran it in a certain context, which starts to give you a source of competitive advantage. You're learning things that your competitors probably aren't. That's really, really valuable. Executive confidence in decision making is something that I see really increase when data is on the table. So experiments generate the data that they need to make decisions. So that is a big benefit from an executive point of view. And finally, this might seem as a little thrown on the end. I don't think it is. This is super important for me because I ran a workshop once, and at the end of it, one of the delegates came up to me and said, I've really enjoyed today looking at new ideas, pushing for some things that we should be looking at into the future, but I never get a chance to. This stuff reminds me of why I got into this business in the first place. And I found that when you give employees space and some basic training and just some small resources, it suddenly activates a motivation with them that I don't really see coming from many other sources in organizations right now. So it's an instant way to generate free employee engagement because it's good fun and you feel like you're doing some meaningful work. So one final thought. We've talked about minimum viable products, but what I've found is that it doesn't have to be about products at all. In fact, the principle of minimum viable applies to many situations inside organizations and actually creates a ton of value. Now, this is looking at it from a slightly different point of view from what we've just been looking at. We've been saying there are assumptions behind your idea. You need to find those assumptions, run an experiment, test those assumptions, and decide whether it makes sense to continue with your idea. However, if you use that lens in a different way, minimum viable, whatever, it puts a very interesting spin on innovation from another perspective, which is bureaucracy often bloats many of the processes and the things that we do inside organizations to make them frustrating. They create friction in the system, and we all have fallen victim to bloated bureaucracy, I'm sure. But what I've found when I've been coaching experiments inside organizations is that you get all kinds of things showing up. People saying, well, some of our meetings are like 3 hours long. They really don't need to be. What would a minimum viable meeting for that particular progress that we need to make look like? Oh, this process is so bloated and takes so long. What's the minimum viable process? What's the minimum viable sign-off? What's the minimum viable whatever? And in an era where agility is being prized above so many other things for good reason, we need to move fast, we need to learn fast when we're running experiments. Our ability to look at something and say, do you know, what's the least we need here that we could still do great work, but actually we strip it away to all that we really need. Now, you have to be careful because in some contexts, the breadth of whatever the thing is there for a reason, and we can affect the quality of something by pulling it back too much. But I've seen some really ingenious things happen inside organizations that you might think are pretty dull, they're not very interesting, but they unlock speed, they unlock trust, they unlock value in a really interesting way. I was working with a bank not too long ago that decided on the basis of this that they could reduce the number of governance committees they had across the global bank from 110 down to 13. You should have seen the look of joy around the room on people's faces when they were thinking about the prospect of the number of days of the year they would get back because they're not sitting in governance meetings. But anyway, think about that as another way of thinking about how a minimum viable whatever could show up in your organization as a mean to increasing efficiency. Okay, so let's recap. We've looked at the business case for experimentation. There is a lot of failure out there. We have to be real about that, and we have to make a choice to step into it anyway and learn to be the best at failing well, to do smart failure so that we learn efficiently in our industries. Same for Google as it is for anybody else. We have to be real about that and not be in denial. Secondly, let's look out for innovation trapdoors, these leap of faith assumptions in our ideas, identify what they are, prioritize them, and then we can start to run some small, fast, cheap experiments that give us rich and valuable data to inform decision making, which is coming from a place of much higher confidence than gut feel or reports that perhaps haven't been so helpful in the past when we've been trying to make decisions about where to go next. So as I said, there's some free resources available online. There's an assumption tracker that I've created there. It's in the book, but I've put it online as well. So head over to blszombie.com/resources. If you've got the book or you want to get the book, you'll see the chapters there that goes into a lot more depth than we've been able to do in the time that we've had here. Also, don't forget I said Google this stuff. Minimum viable products information is all over Google, so definitely do that. Get in touch if you wanted to run a bespoke session around this, or you're interested in more resources. I can point you in their direction. So that was module 6, how to run low risk experiments. Next module will be selling your idea and influencing. So often an idea starts to show promise, and the forces within the organization that are really not in favor of tomorrow, the enemies of your future, start to pull it down. So I'm going to share with you some practical tools, techniques that I've seen that intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs have used to help navigate their idea through the system to a point where it can scale, because it makes sense to scale, because they've got evidence to prove that this is something that could help us gain more relevance in the future. So I invite you to head over there now, and I hope this has been useful. If it has, please do think about sharing it with other people who you think might also benefit from it. Thanks.